That concludes the press conference with President Trump and President Putin, in which they took no questions from the press.
Really more, press statements, I guess.
Press statements. That was not according to plan. Vladimir Putin spoke first. He talked about nascent progress. He talked about turning the page with the United States, at times getting almost elegiac as he talked about the international dateline and stepping from yesterday into tomorrow. But with all of that, he gave nothing away in terms of any progress that might have been made on the key questions, and neither did President Trump, who said he has a fantastic relationship with President Putin, whom he called Vladimir. Thank you very much, Vladimir. He basically ended his remarks by saying he said there had been progress, but he wouldn't say on what. And he did say that there is one very significant issue that remains outstanding. He gave no indication of that, and I now turn to Margaret Brennan, who is with me. The president also said he would check in with NATO and Vladimir Zelensky. But on that one question that remains outstanding, he says very big. What do you assume that is?
Well, the one thing he told us to expect was a ceasefire. We heard nothing about that, John. We didn't hear any description of any form, even a modified one. There had been speculation that you might see, for example, a halt to aerial activity, the kind of drone attacks or missile attacks on cities you've been seeing of late, and let that war in the East continue with tanks and soldiers. Nothing. We didn't hear any of that. And you heard from President Trump a reference instead back to his own political travails, so to speak. He talked about Russiagate, that reference to the intelligence community and the bipartisan Senate findings that Russia did interfere in the 2016 election. That is such a thorn in the president's side. It bothers him so greatly, and it comes up anytime you hear Russia mentioned. So for him, there's almost, you almost hear this kinship as he was describing it with Vladimir Putin, saying, well, he understood it was a hoax. Right. I knew it was a hoax. All the intelligence officials were wrong. One of the many ways he was testifying to the strength of their relationship. Nancy Cordes is in the room. Nancy, you didn't get a question, but then again, nobody else did either.
Right, and therefore you can't really call that a press conference. It's unclear what that was, because President Trump and President Putin came out. They spoke highly of each other. President Trump vaguely referred to progress that had been made in one area in particular. But he didn't even say what that area was. He said he was going to call his European counterparts and let them know, and then he thanked Vladimir Putin, and they walked off the stage. And it is going to be difficult for them to avoid the perception that this was meant to enable Vladimir Putin to stand side by side with President Trump behind the podiums on stage, without then having to take any questions from Western journalists, because all day long here in Alaska, reporters have been shouting questions at Putin, shouting questions like, why are you targeting civilians? And why should anyone trust you? And he has either made a gesture to indicate that he can't hear or that he can't understand. In any event, he hasn't answered those questions. But that would have been tough to continue to do if he was standing there behind the podium, having those questions translated for him in real time. So both men have now left the stage. We don't know if President Trump is going to come back later on his own and give us more information. We don't know how significant any of this progress really is. We'd like to ask White House officials, but they left the room just as quickly as President Trump did.
And what Nancy is describing there, John, is just a continuation of the breaking of the norms that we have seen. One thing of note, it is traditional for the host country, their leader, to speak first when you are bringing in a foreign leader. It was also interesting to see President Trump defer to President Putin and say, no, you go first. And it was almost, as you were watching his face, like he was hearing for the first time some of the things Vladimir Putin was saying, listening to hear a direction there. But the substance wasn't there in terms of ceasefire, the one thing we were told that we needed to listen in for. Now, we don't know, because they didn't tell us in this context. Does that mean that will be negotiated later today by the military advisors? Or are we done? Is President Trump heading back to Washington earlier than planned? Is that trilateral summit with Vladimir Zelensky going to happen? We don't know any of that. And one of the reasons why we keep coming back to the experts in the room idea is, as Ambassador Sullivan was describing to us, the two men sitting next to Vladimir Putin have been doing this a really long time. The two men standing next to Donald Trump are very new to diplomacy, as is this president. And they have held information so closely in that circle that all the institutions that are built up there to support with the, well, did you think of this? And if he says this, this is what he really means. That expertise that the United States has built up over long is lacking. That may sound like busy work, but it's actually important to play things out. And I know Ambassador Sullivan is one of those people because he was a career in the Foreign Service and knows, and he is listening in here. Ambassador Sullivan, this was all quite unusual. Can we say anything was achieved today?
You know, Margaret, my reaction is, I'll quote a political expression from the last century. This was a nothing burger. I mean, where's the beef? There's nothing there. They could have issued these statements on Inauguration Day, January 20th of this year. It's now the middle of August. The Trump administration keeps talking about wanting to get a signal from President Putin about whether he's serious about peace. Putin said nothing today concretely that would indicate that he is serious about achieving peace in Ukraine. Margaret, as you said, if this is all that happens, if this statement is it, there aren't going to be further meetings, there aren't going to be further briefings, et cetera. It was a whole lot of to do about nothing.
But we had heard from the president he'd know in the first 2 minutes, John, whether a deal was possible. They talked for two and a half hours or more. And I don't know the answer to this.
Right. We certainly didn't get the answer to that from what we just saw. You can imagine a range of possibilities. One is, as the president said, no, there isn't a deal until there's a deal, which is to say nothing is decided until everything's decided, to use another political phrase. So it could be thorny issues to go, but they made progress. One thing that hasn't yet happened is Vladimir Putin got the extremely warm welcome, and he got the very cordial treatment by the president, as Margaret outlined, in this experience that took place in front of the press. We don't dare call it a press conference. What didn't yet happen, I don't think, is President Trump did not repeat some of the talking points that Vladimir Putin has offered about who started the war, that kind of thing. And that was, in terms of the fears, Ambassador Sullivan, that the Europeans would have had. First of all, what's your interpretation of how they read this? But also, they were worried that he would come out with an agreement, President Trump would agree to something that really put Ukraine in a bad position. That has not yet happened.
Sure. So the downside, the major downside has been avoided. But if we take President Trump at his word that he would know in the first few minutes whether President Putin was serious about peace, the fact that they met for 2.5, maybe 3 hours, and now have this press conference, is that an indication that President Trump believes that Vladimir Putin is seriously interested in peace in Ukraine? I've seen no evidence to support that proposition. It may be the president's intuition, but there's no evidence to support that. In fact, all the evidence is to the contrary.
And we want to bring back into the conversation CBS News national security contributor Samantha Vinograd. Sam, President Trump has been speaking quite a lot about what he wanted out of this meeting today. He said there would be big consequences if Vladimir Putin didn't do what he wanted. And we know that was ceasefire. So we heard nothing about consequences for failing to achieve either. It's hard to know if this was a way of avoiding saying, I can't get a deal here, or is something else? Is there a strategy that you can discern from this?
I can't quite discern a strategy. Ending a war certainly does take time, which is something that President Trump did not seem to recognize on the campaign trail over the last few months when he said he could end this war quickly. And I agree wholeheartedly with Ambassador Sullivan that this was a nothing burger when it comes to a ceasefire arrangement for Ukraine, but it wasn't a nothing burger when it comes to Vladimir Putin's objectives more broadly. Vladimir Putin got the red carpet welcome in Alaska, and as you just articulated, Margaret, no new sanctions have been announced on Russia. We heard nothing about additional secondary tariffs, for example, on China, the largest customer of Russian oil. And so Vladimir Putin has successfully continued the stalling game that he's been playing for months, in which President Trump threatens to punish Putin even more strongly than the current architecture, and then Putin moves the goalposts yet again. So that's a big takeaway for me from this summit. Vladimir Putin walks away having met some of his objectives while the fighting continues on in Ukraine, and this war of attrition, which Putin is very willing to continue fighting, is ongoing. We heard nothing about any kind of stall in fighting whatsoever. So I do think Vladimir Putin is walking away from this summit feeling like he scored some major wins.
Well, one of the things Vladimir Putin said in his remarks that were translated was, I hope the Europeans won't torpedo our nascent progress. And he talked about Russia as if it were the victim here, as if it didn't launch that full-scale invasion in 2022, and as if it didn't start the invasion back in 2014. As to your point there, Sam, as you're talking about shaping narrative and Vladimir Putin walking away looking as if he's achieved something, those assertions by him were not challenged by President Trump.
And it brings to mind, of course, the instance in which President Trump did challenge assertions when Volodymyr Zelensky was in the Oval Office. He left him no quarter when he suggested, from hard-won experience, that Vladimir Putin couldn't be trusted, a position that President Trump then later came to, publicly expressing his disappointment with President Putin for having constantly told him or appeared to be moving towards a peace and then increasing the bombing. But there was fact-checking, to use a term from our business, in the meeting with Zelensky. Nothing of that today.
And there was immediate consequence. There was that shutoff for a brief period of time of U.S. intelligence sharing and military aid for Volodymyr Zelensky. We have not heard consequence here. There is, over in the Capitol, a big sanctions bill teed up, ready to go as soon as President Trump says go, that would have the weight of law behind it, but it would hit China, someone President Trump's trying to negotiate with. It would do other things that hurt Russia. There are tools he could use if he wanted to. Let's bring in senior foreign correspondent Deborah Patta. Deborah, how do you think Volodymyr Zelensky is receiving what we just watched and or other European leaders?
Well, interestingly, John, there's been no word from President Zelensky up until now. He's probably waiting for that call from President Trump to hear exactly what it is that they discussed. And he said, interestingly, in his remarks, that he was going to take this to the European leaders and to Zelensky to see what they thought of it, that ultimately it would be up to them to decide. Before this summit began, Zelensky did comment, and very interestingly, he reminded the world of the most important thing as far as Ukraine is concerned, that this war continues, that there were strikes today in Sumy, he said, in Dnipro, in Zaporizhia, and also in Kherson, that the war has not stopped. He reminded everyone that Ukraine is ready to work productively to end the war, but that they are counting on a strong position from America. Everything, Zelensky said before this meeting, will depend on America. The Russians factor in American strength, he said. Make no mistake. They're going to continue coordinating with their partners in Europe and preparing for an upcoming discussion, and that Russia must end the war. That is the constant refrain that you hear from Ukraine, and nothing has really changed there. And I think that President Zelensky will think that this is probably what he expected. They didn't have very high hopes for this. They've been dealing with President Putin for this entire duration, more than 3.5 years of war and prior to that. And this is something that they weren't even considering would be factored in today, that there would be a ceasefire announced.
Deborah Pata, thank you. Margaret, you are in constant touch with the Ukrainians. What's your sense of how the ambassador in Washington feels about this, or others, how they would have read this?
I've been reaching out to many of them, and so far they have not yet heard from the president. He said he was going to call some European leaders as well as Vladimir Zelensky. They don't yet know. We may hear in the next few hours their take. Perhaps there was something in the room that was not shared with us. But we know President Trump has put together, remember that minerals agreement? That part, a lot of that rich territory is in the east. So this interest in carving it up, or this interest as to why the Treasury Secretary was in the room, we don't know a lot of that detail just yet.
And to remind viewers, we don't know any detail about anything. There is nothing but pleasantries and polite remarks between the two leaders, but there was absolutely no detail about any of the key questions for which the two men came to Alaska and brought all of their senior advisors. Let's turn now to Nancy Cordes, chief White House correspondent. Nancy, one thing that struck me, and I wonder if it did you too, is Vladimir Putin said that he agreed with Donald Trump, who said that if he were in office, there would be no war in Ukraine. An extraordinary statement, but also one that undoubtedly was well received by the president.
Absolutely. I mean, how many times have we heard President Trump say over the past 6 months, if I were president, this war never would have started? He says it every single time he talks to the White House press corps. And so to hear it echoed by Putin himself today would likely be the kind of thing that the Russians know might be music to President Trump's ears. And it's exactly the kind of thing that the Ukrainians were concerned about. They were worried that President Trump, over the past couple of months, has been moving more and more to their position. He's gotten tougher on Putin. He's grown frustrated with the fact that he has wanted to come to the table to discuss a ceasefire. The Ukrainians are all in for a ceasefire, and Russia has been balking. And so they said point blank over the past couple of days, we think he's going to go and flatter Donald Trump. He's going to try to bring Trump back to his side. And we just hope that President Trump doesn't fall for it. Now, it remains to be seen whether there were any concrete agreements that were made here that might indicate that a ceasefire is closer than it was before. We simply don't know. But certainly Putin's strategy here, while he was speaking, was to say the things that President Trump himself likes to hear.
And Nancy, rein me in here if this goes too far, but we usually hear President Trump in evaluating events that have taken place, even ones that we've witnessed at the same time with him, in extraordinary terms of success and greatness. And in this, by that measurement, this seemed to be, would you say, muted with respect to the way President Trump characterized the meeting that he'd just taken part in?
Muted, vague, and perplexing. He said that they had made progress in a number of important areas, one area in particular that's very important, but he didn't give any more insight into what that area would be. And certainly, if he felt that they were very close to a ceasefire, he would just come out and say that. Now, he did say that he wants to talk to his European counterparts, which is something that he promised to do right after this summit, because they were very emphatic that they didn't want him negotiating on Ukraine's behalf. They wanted that to wait until Ukraine could be part of a second summit. And so the fact that he said he wanted to fill in his European counterparts before talking to the press, perhaps that is a good sign that he is respecting their wishes. But again, we simply don't know, John. And you're right. President Trump is not the type of person to shy away from crowing about a big success or even a big perceived success if he thinks he has buttoned one up.
Margaret, we will learn, of course, in the hours, minutes, days about what's really going on, where things really are. But as both men leave Anchorage, or when they do, Vladimir Putin leaves with something that he's been given from the minute he landed until now that no other nation could give him: the prestige of standing as an equal with the President of the United States.
standing as an equal, getting a far more effusive and warm welcome than we have seen President Trump give to any world leader in the second administration. Now, is that strategic? Does that soften him up for the deal that we don't yet know about? Does this give him the respect that he so desires? One of the things that I thought was interesting is in order to prep himself ahead of this meeting on the plane ride here, President Trump turned to one of Vladimir Putin's closest friends, to the degree he has them, and that is another dictator from Belarus, the place where Russian troops staged before they invade Ukraine, praising him as a great leader, someone who is a massive human rights abuser and under U.S. sanctions. So he was thanking the person who had helped as a back channel set up this meeting, praising him. What kind of preparation went in for him in that room today? For the foreign policy experts out there, they did breathe a sigh of relief to see that the Secretary of State, who has been more sort of strong in his language in support of Ukraine, was there by his side. He is the one who's been coordinating with the Europeans. There was the strategy of bringing in these military advisors, including the Supreme Allied Commander. And I have said that a few times now, but that is a powerful statement because NATO sees Russia as the prime threat for all of Europe right now. And so you have people who are very clear as to what Vladimir Putin has done there with the president, but he was not clear in his remarks in the way that they would have been. And so we will continue reporting on this, as you can imagine, in the coming days.
Former Russian ambassador to Russia, Sullivan, your final thoughts on this?
Well, if this is all there is, if there's nothing else that has either been agreed to or further meetings, Putin not only got the benefit of the red carpet treatment, but he's tapped the President Trump along again, to use President Trump's expression. How is President Trump now going to, without a ceasefire, he was threatening to impose massive sanctions. After this press conference, how can the president go back to that? It's very difficult to see that happening. I think this is just part of a delay strategy by Putin to keep the war going.
All right, Ambassador Sullivan, thank you so much. That President Trump and Russian President Putin gave a short press conference and took no questions, so it wasn't really a press conference at all. They met for about 3 hours earlier today, just moments ago. Both President Trump and Putin called today's summit productive, but we did not hear anything concrete that came out of the talks. President Trump said he will call Ukrainian President Zelensky to report on the meeting. Our coverage continues on CBS News 24/7. And for those of you in the West, there will be more on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm John Dickerson with Margaret Brennan in Anchorage, Alaska.